A veteran Mage DPS main, or even a Savage rating Mage main, might find it entirely obvious why things like quote-unquote ABC is important and why you might actually want to stand up close to the enemy. Such a player might also know exactly what, why, and when to cast what spell down to the smallest detail, even the situational ones, not use Gaith. Now, obviously, some mistakes are much more impactful to make than others. However, regardless of that, these kinds of mistakes might not even come up on the radar for newer players or perhaps even somewhat casual players. Of course, if you beat a dungeon or a boss or whatever it is, then you probably did just fine. Most of these mistakes listed in this video will mainly be things that can make your experience easier and faster and likely might just feel better. So, in this video, I will cover a few common, or at times uncommon, mistakes and then explain how it can be done differently to fix it. Number 1. I'm probably safer far away from enemies. Intuitively, the further you are away from enemies, the harder it would be for them to swing at you, right? It makes sense. The problem is that aside from auto attacks, most enemies are perfectly capable of striking you in particular if they want to. Whether you are in melee range or far away, that circle AoE is coming just the same. The only difference is that if you are on the edge of the arena, then at least one direction of escape is blocked off due to the edge of the arena. Similarly, many bosses have donut AoEs, which will hit you if you are far away. Or cone AoEs that, if aimed directly at you, can be outright impossible to evade if you are far away due to how cones expand out. Finally, while healers have a reasonably long range on many of their healing spells, they don't have infinite range. So if you're over there Narnia hanging out with the White Witch, there's a very good chance that the healer will completely miss you with their AoE healing. And while some healers will send a single target heal your way to make sure you don't die from that mistake, some healers will outright take offense to you dodging their heals and instead intentionally leave you out to dry. The solution to this problem is essentially that if you cannot come up with a good reason why you are 30 miles away playing artillery, you should get closer. Being far away just puts you in a false sense of security because, as I mentioned, the bosses are perfectly capable of hitting you anyway if they actually want to. The only thing you're protecting yourself from is it gives you 1 or 2 extra seconds to accept the fact that you might die when the tank dies and the boss turns to you. On the other hand, if you are close most of the time, this leads to an easy experience dodging attacks, since many attacks from bosses originate from them. Cone AoEs, half-room cleaves, and so on. If the boss happens to do a circle AoE under them, that is of course a reason to stand a little bit away, but not in Narnia. That helps no one. Number 2. Absurd freestyle rotations. This one is a bit complicated, but generally speaking, Mage DPS jobs, unlike both melee and range, have way more easy access to use whatever they want as their next GCD, which can often lead to huge misunderstandings as to what they're supposed to use. A melee DPS is often naturally herded into doing 1-2-3 combos simply because the attacks themselves explain that naturally, and the higher steps of combos obviously do more damage. A ranged DPS has the same experience, or things like dots that are obviously better when the dot is not there, and then simply one filler attack for the rest. But for mages, technically, summoners could choose to use Rune 3 during Ifrit if they don't like using Ruby Right. A red mage could choose to use long casts because they observe that they have more potency than the shorter casts. And a black mage might actually conclude that Blizzard 4 is better than Fire 4 because they have the same potency, and Blizzard 4 has a shorter cast time because there are some pieces of information not actually shown. What I'm getting at is that unlike other DPS jobs, where what you're supposed to do is sort of intuitive, mages don't really have these same types of guardrails, so let's talk about that for a bit. If you simply assume that your toolkit makes logical sense, then you can surmise for yourself that, for example, Summoner wouldn't be given Ruby Rights to cast if Rune 3 was better. Red Mage wouldn't have shorter cast time spells if the longer ones were always objectively better. Black Mage's Fire 4 wouldn't be way more complicated by costing MP and taking more time to cast than Blizzard 4 if it wasn't better. Indeed, sometimes there are some weird outliers. For example, Summoner's Titan and Garuda sections at level 90 are better than the Ifrit section despite being easier to use since they are mainly instant casts. You could hypothetically conclude that the reason Red Mage has shorter casts is so that you can use them when there isn't time to cast a longer one. And, well, you might not know how much stronger Fire 4 is than Blizzard 4. In other words, this is like a somewhat long-winded call to action to remind you to check the potency on your spells, check the cast time on your spells, and if necessary, like with Black Mage, see if there's something you're missing, before just concluding that a spell is useless. For example, Scathe is considered somewhat useless in many contexts because its average potency is 120, and casting it just once could mean you get robbed of one Fire 4 use, which, by the way, has a comparable potency of 558, which is so much more. So much that if your choice is Scathe or nothing, if doing nothing means you can cast Fire 4 in like 10 seconds, then it would still be better than casting Scathe now. These kinds of somewhat absurd comparisons are not entirely unusual to mages. Another example of how absurd mages can get is the simple fact that if you, as a red mage, accidentally start casting a long spell, like the Thunder, without dual cast, if you don't realize until like halfway through the cast, then it is obviously better to finish the cast, because you've already waited the time that you could have saved by not long casting. That might sound really weird, but the general gist of that is that often mages benefit from finishing their casts, even if it isn't always the best cast, with the exception that sometimes Black Mage can make catastrophic mistakes by doing so. In summary, just because the arrow has more potency than Jolt doesn't mean it is actually better to cast it, because Jolt takes half the time to cast. Yes, remember that the cast time itself doesn't matter that much if the recast time is longer. Number 3. ABC means always be casting, but only be casting the right thing. Or what? Indeed, ABC is a very classic piece of advice for casters. In fact, in Final Fantasy XIV, this even applies to physical jobs, as what ABC really means in this context is keep that GCD spinning, always be doing something. How this can clash with optimal rotations is that because mages often have to stand still to cast something, if the boss starts targeting you with something that requires you to act, then that might break your perfect rotation. Now you have to choose between pausing your rotation to awkwardly move, or change your rotation and adjust it to the situation. Each mage has a few differences in this regard, so let me give an example of how this could work for each of them. For Summoner, which many of us refer to as an honorary ranged physical job due to the sheer amount of mobility the job has, actually has a part of its rotation where it can be a problem if it suddenly gets targeted by something. If you happen to be forced to move or get away from the boss during the Ifrit part of the rotation, then this could lead you into a situation where you have to choose between doing nothing at all or casting Ruin 3, depending on how urgent it is that you move, of course. Naturally, casting Ruin 3 is always better than doing nothing, but this is at odds with the optimal choice, which is to spend your Ruby Rights and the Crimson Strikes, and normally you only have time for one Ruin 3 anyway. This can then have a snowball effect where if you do delay, you might feel compelled to spend your Ruby Rights and Crimson Strikes anyway, while Phoenix or Bahamut drifts away, which might not be worth it. It usually isn't. But casting something is better than casting nothing, and for the future, it is not a bad idea to try and plan it so that Ifrit comes out at a time where you can stand safely. And then you can fit the 2 other summons when it is less safe and you can move around anyway. For Red Mage, Reprise is sort of intended to be the mobility option, but it is so expensive that it is hardly ever worth it. It is, however, if necessary, better than doing nothing, but this also circles a bit back to planning ahead like I alluded to with Summoner just before. If you know you have to move a bit in a moment, saving a use of acceleration or even Swiftcast can sometimes dodge this problem outright. But the most interesting solution from a red mage perspective is that your melee combo is actually your most mobile part of your rotation. So if a big mobility section is coming up, you might actually save your burst for moving. For Black Mage, it gets a lot more complicated, simply because you have so long sections of your rotation where you would rather not have to go anywhere. However, what often becomes a problem is that once you realize that triple cast and Swiftcast can be flipped into direct DPS gains for Black Mage, we'll get back to this one, you might feel compelled to save those for bursts. But if you save all of them for bursts, and save all of your polyglots for instant xenoclasses for bursts, then eventually you reach a point where you don't have anything for moving. Planning and knowing where to be beforehand, which is also helpful for summoners and red mages, can help you to not need bursts of movement. But if you save all of your movement options because it is a damage loss to otherwise, then what is possibly going to happen is that you will have to either A, awkwardly walk over to the safe spot, or use a serial manipulation of course, or B, use Scathe, which you probably don't want. What I'm ultimately getting at here, a bit for all three mages, is that using your mobility resources for movement is often an indirect DPS gain if you actually have to move while continuing your attack. This might sound entirely obvious of course, but it isn't for everyone. Number 4. Your AoE is centered on your target. For all three mages, your area of effect, or AoE for short, attacks are all centered on whatever it is you're targeting, with the only exception being that Red Mage's Moulinet is a circle AoE slightly in front of them, pointed in the direction of their target. Aside from this one, all other AoE options are heavily dictated by where your target is, including Red Mage's Resolution, which is a line going through your target. Knowing this, there are two specific details to keep in mind when dealing with a large pack of mobs. 1. Try to make sure whatever your target is somewhat central to the pack so your AoE hits as many as possible. And 2. Considering in more recent times we have seen a lot of huge mobs with so big bodies that they can shove everything else further away than 5 yalms. Meaning that the Flare, Scourge, Catastrophes, Achmon, Foul, and even Flare can completely miss all but that one central target, if you choose to park your primary target on the wrong thing. This can be somewhat fixed if the mobs shuffle in under the targeting reticle, but this is still very much worth considering when choosing your target. Another thing to consider is that if a specific portion of the pack you're fighting is a lot healthier than the rest, it might be a DPS loss for you, but choosing to center on a mob closer to the healthier ones might concentrate your damage on the mobs that need to take more damage, leaving the weaker mobs to get cleaned up by someone who has more fine control over where their AoE lands, like the tank and the healer, if it isn't an astrologian of course. Another detail to AoE, which of course mainly revolves around AoE pulls in dungeons, is that while you can start using all your cooldowns while the tank is pulling, and a lot of the time it feels like your only option aside from doing nothing, saving your cooldowns until everything is clumped up can sometimes lead to a faster clear overall. What I mean by this is that a Black Mage might find it quite difficult to cast a lot of things on the mobs the tank has already pulled while they keep running. Your best options that don't spend cooldowns directly tend to be Thundercloud procs or maybe an Ice Paradox you prepared earlier. But if that runs out, you can end up feeling compelled to use triple cast and things like that. However, that triple cast could have let you deal way more damage once the pack is completely bunched up later. Similarly, a summoner might feel compelled to throw Bahamut out there immediately, since at the start of a dungeon, your alternative is Try Disaster, which isn't going to work well probably. Once again, the sheer amount of damage Bahamut can fire out the moment he is summoned might be better served to be kept until the pack is fully bunched up. The question there is of course whether you can still get full value out of Bahamut if you cast it early. The real tip here being, think ahead before you call him down. And for Red Mage, it tends to be a lot easier, simply because you get at least a swift cast and an acceleration per pack. Plus, clever use of displacement can give you the head start on the run needed to cast something. The important lesson here is that saving your biggest cooldowns for when the pack is fully bunched up can sometimes lead to the pack dying sooner, even if it feels very awkward to just kinda run next to the pack while that samurai is spinning like crazy. Ultimately, the AoE pull is as long as it takes to kill the last mob. Number 5. Swift casting is a damage gain because I skip the cast time. This one is really weird because it is sort of a misconception. It is kind of true, but then not completely. It depends on what you're casting and how you used Swiftcast. What I mean by this is that Swiftcast removes the cast time on the spell. That of course means that you could move while using the spell, which you otherwise wouldn't be able to. If that was necessary, yes, a DPS gain indeed. But if you didn't need the movement, then the actual gain is less. For a summoner, the damage gain is usually 0 unless we're talking rate buffs. What I mean by this is that your attacks check your buffs when the spell finishes, not when you start the cast. So if you swift cast out Slipstream, and you had a damage buff at that moment, but you would have lost it in 2 seconds, meaning before properly cast Slipstream could have finished, then you gained that difference in damage. Not a lot, but it is something. For Red Mage, Swiftcast of course lets you skip Jolt and hop directly to Thunder or Arrow, which is a 2 mana and 60 potency net gain. However, depending on whether that messes with the timing of Flesh and Contra 6, this can require an additional skipped cast with acceleration, for it to not turn around and become a loss later down the line. That's a bit more complicated, but let's take an example where swift casting is a gain, where Summoner has a longer GCD than the cast time on any spell that is longer than 2.5 seconds anyway, completely removing any potential gain you could directly acquire by swift casting. Black Mage has a select few spells with cast times longer than the GCD. Firefall, Despair, Flare, Freeze, High Blizzard 2 and High Fire 2, being the primary spells you might actually want to do that with. Just to take one particular example of this, Firefall has a cast time of 2.8 seconds by default and a GCD of 2.5. That is with 0 spell speed of course. That means that if you swift cast it, you remove the cast time, making it take 2.5 seconds to use instead of 2.8. That is an approximate DPS gained, you could say, of around 12%. If, for example, your GCD was 2.19, which is quite fast I admit, then the cast time of Firefall would be around 2.45. Again, swift casting is still around 12% DPS gain for that one cast. This is made even more complicated by the fact that sometimes Black Mage can get away with burst sequences that are better or worse depending on whether they have swift casts and triple casts available. A particular example of this being that on large AoE packs, spamming High Fire 2 and then finishing with just one flare is often better than the double flare after a few High Fire 2s, but only if you don't triple cast or swift cast anything. But usually you have one triple cast for such a situation anyway, which is why this doesn't come up that much. So to clarify, the real mistake here is to assume that swift casting and skipping the cast time is always a gain. The time where swift casting stops being beneficial entirely is that using an OGCD, an ability such as Swiftcast, incurs an animation lock where you can't do anything else other than moving. This takes half a second plus 2 times your latency. I usually assume this totals around 0.625 seconds, a fourth of the base GCD. If you cast, I don't know, Fire 4, Swift Cast, then the instant Fire 4 followed by another Fire 4, then you will actually have cast those 3 Fire 4s slower overall than if you had skipped Swift Cast and simply cast Fire 4 3 times in a row. This is because Swiftcast delayed your cast by that 0.625 seconds. There's also other factors such as the cast attacks that can play in here, but that is a different story which I talked about a bit in more detail in another video, link in the description. So with that said, do you have any advice for aspiring DPS mages? Maybe a mistake you see happen a lot? I would love to hear about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, originally Summoner's Ruby Rite had a cast time of 2.8, it still does, and a GCD of 2.5. This meant that it was a literal DPS gain to use Swiftcast on Ruby Rite every time. This was later changed in patch 6.1, where the action got a potency boost and the GCD increased to 3 seconds. which both means that swift casting no longer is a DPS gain, and simultaneously that the spell is not affected by the added 0.1 lock from caster tags.